When it comes to collecting video games, there's really two main objectives that every collector has: getting the games that you want and getting them for as cheap as possible. Sounds good, right? In order to achieve these goals, it's really going to vary depending on the collector, since we all have different tastes. And so the purpose of this video is to discuss a lot of the factors that are going to be helpful to consider. Okay, the first thing I want to address is actually this idea that you should go after whatever console is the cheapest. The strategy here is that while collecting for one console is trending and the prices are really high, you should be looking elsewhere to collect for other consoles that not as many people are paying attention to, and therefore will be more likely to have lower prices. I think this is generally good advice, but the one distinction I'd like to add to this is that you shouldn't collect for a certain console just because it's cheap if the games aren't something you'll end up playing. But what if you're somebody who's perfectly fine with never playing certain games you buy, or think that maybe you'll grow to like them years down the road? Well, that's all perfectly well and good, but my point is just to be aware of these kinds of things and have that rationale in place when deciding to make the purchase. I've seen some collectors buy a bunch of games for a certain console just because it was cheap, who ultimately ended up disappointed because they didn't actually enjoy playing any of the games. So again, just be aware of what your goals are. On the flip side, avoiding collecting for a certain console that you really want games for just because prices are high isn't always a good idea in my opinion. Sometimes even though the price of a game may be high, it might actually be worth having in your collection if it's a game you really want and that you'll get a ton of enjoyment out of. I've always been a huge advocate of quality over quantity, not that there's anything wrong with quantity, and so really focusing on the games you want the most goes hand in hand with my philosophy. Not to mention there are ways around paying those high prices if you're patient. Don't force yourself into buying a game at a high price if it makes you uncomfortable. I think a lot of times people panic because they think the price will just keep going up and up. While that is possible, it's really smart to pay attention to how the prices of games you're interested in have been trending. Pricecharting.com is actually a great resource for keeping track of that. Highly recommended. Alright, now I want to talk about another huge factor when it comes to choosing which console to collect for, and that would be nostalgia. It makes sense. Usually some of the first consoles people collect for as an adult are the consoles that they had as a kid. It can be a lot of fun to play the games you remember when you were younger, as well as the games that you remember hearing about for the system, or perhaps only ever played in small doses at a friend's house as a rental or what have you. But this is where I'm going to go one step further and make a recommendation that collectors can sometimes be resistant to embrace. That would be to start collecting for the rival consoles that you ignored and possibly even hated when you were younger. No longer are you restricted by the limitations of being a kid, where you likely could only have a single console from each generation. It's time to put aside what were likely some made-up reasons you had for hating those other consoles and treat yourself to some new experiences that you missed out on. For example, I had a Sega Genesis growing up, and while I love that console and it's still one of my favorites to this day, one of the greatest experiences as an adult gamer was digging through the Super Nintendo's library and playing all the amazing games. This strategy is especially effective for retro games because consoles were a lot different back then, more unique for sure. In later years, consoles would start to have more and more of the same games, and so when looking at something like, say, the PS4 and Xbox One, sure, there's still exclusives, but an overwhelming majority of the games available are on both systems and the exact same game, give or take some differences in areas related to technical performance. Then there's also the consoles that very few people had back in the day, but we had all heard about. Stuff like the Sega Saturn and Neo Geo comes to mind. This is where things can get kind of tricky because while these games present a great opportunity to experience something we missed out on as a kid, because they didn't sell a ton of units back in the day, that means there's less of it to go around these days for us retro gamers. So, yep, you know what that means. They're expensive. The best suggestion I can give for dealing with this is to look into alternative ways to play these games, perhaps being released for other consoles or even in a collection or compilation of some kind. And this actually leads me to my next topic of consideration. There's generally a lot of different ways to collect certain games, and you'll need to consider stuff like re-releases, remakes, HD remasters, and heck, even backwards compatibility. For example, the Xbox One supports games from every Xbox system that came before it. Not every single game, but quite a few, and so if you own that console, you can essentially collect for all Xbox consoles just by default. So you'll definitely want to keep in mind which games you'll have access to with any given console, because it's usually not just the games that were originally released on it. Alright, so there you have it. Those are some of my tips for collecting and questions that you should be asking yourself when making a decision. It's funny though, I've actually found that what often happens with collectors is they just end up collecting for nearly every system anyway. However, even if you are somebody who does that, the order and priority in which you collect will still matter, and so hopefully you find this video to be helpful. With that said, for this week's question, I'd like to ask everybody what your mentality is when deciding which consoles to collect for. Does any of it overlap with what I've said, or perhaps you have a unique strategy that has worked well for you personally? I'd love to hear what you have to say, so go ahead and leave a comment down below, and I will see ya in the next video.